A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
What were the dates of those footprints?
I work for the Bureau of Land Management in Burns District. I've been the district archaeologist here for 21 years.
What you're looking at right now is a murder weapon. Sort of. This little orange scraper, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, was carved with extraordinary precision from a piece of Oregon agate. It was designed to cut, scrape, and process animal hides. And when scientists analyzed the microscopic residue still clinging to its edge, they found something that stopped the entire archaeological world in its tracks. Blood. Ancient bison blood. From a species that has been extinct for over 10,000 years. And this tool, it was buried more than 18,000 years ago, beneath a sealed layer of volcanic ash, in a shallow rock shelter tucked into the remote desert of southeastern Oregon. 18,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. When this tool was made, the pyramids of Egypt were still more than 13,000 years away from being built. The Roman Empire was still 17,000 years in the future. Agriculture itself hadn't been invented yet. And here, in what is now Oregon, a human being was sitting in a rock shelter, butchering an enormous extinct bison with a hand-crafted stone tool, and we have the evidence to prove it. But here's the thing that makes this discovery truly mind-bending. According to everything we thought we knew about American prehistory, those humans should not have been there. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Because for nearly a century, scientists believed the first Americans arrived no earlier than 13,500 years ago. And this discovery doesn't just challenge that theory, it obliterates it. To understand why this discovery is so revolutionary, you need to understand the theory it's replacing. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists held firm to what was called the Clovis First hypothesis, and it was the closest thing to a law of physics that American archaeology had. The story went like this. Roughly 13,500 years ago, a group of Stone Age hunters crossed a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska, in a region we now call Beringia. As glaciers slowly retreated, an ice-free corridor opened through the interior of Canada. These hunters, the Clovis people, followed herds of megafauna south through that gap, eventually spilling out into the open continent. They were extraordinarily skilled. Their signature artifact was a long, leaf-shaped spear point with a distinctive groove, a flute, carved into its base. Clovis points have been found from Canada to Mexico, from California to Florida. By 13,000 years ago, these people had effectively populated 2 continents. For decades, this was gospel. Archaeologists who claimed to find anything older were met with fierce skepticism. The Clovis model was so entrenched that it had its own name for challengers. Pre-Clovis. It was almost a dirty word in the field, the archaeological equivalent of claiming you'd found a ghost. Then, the cracks started to appear. In the 1970s and 80s, a site in Chile called Monte Verde began yielding evidence of human habitation that predated Clovis by at least 1,000 years. In Pennsylvania, the Meadowcroft Rockshelter produced dates stretching back to what we now understand as nearly 19,000 calendar years ago. And in Oregon, at a site called Paisley Caves, scientists discovered fossilized human feces, coprolites, containing ancient DNA dated to 14,300 years ago. Each of these sites chipped away at the Clovis First model, but most archaeologists held on. More data needed, they said. Contamination is possible. The stratigraphy could be disturbed. What they needed was a site so perfectly preserved, so geologically unimpeachable, so undeniably clear, that even the most skeptical voice in the room would have to concede. They found it in the middle of the Oregon desert, and it has a name, Rimrock Draw Rockshelter. Rimrock Draw Rockshelter sits about 10 miles northwest of the tiny town of Riley in Harney County, the largest county in Oregon, and one of the most remote places in the continental United States. The landscape here is a high desert sagebrush steppe at 4,500 feet of elevation. It is vast, dry, and hauntingly beautiful. And for thousands of years it looked nothing like this. The site itself is a shallow overhang, almost more of a notch than a cave, carved into a ridge of ancient basalt. It's not dramatic to look at, but archaeologist Patrick O'Grady, a staff archaeologist at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History, saw something in it that others hadn't. The rock shelter was discovered not by a formal survey, but by a stroke of luck. A BLM archaeologist named Scott McDermott was driving supplies to a nearby dig when he spotted an unusual fold in the basalt. He stopped his truck and took a closer look. What he found was a sheltered microenvironment, a place where sediments had been accumulating, undisturbed, for potentially thousands of years. He called O'Grady. O'Grady drove out. And in 2011, with an official partnership between the University of Oregon and the Bureau of Land Management, they started digging. The first few seasons were promising but not spectacular. The team uncovered stone flakes, the debris from tool making, and small animal bones, suggesting the shelter had been used repeatedly over thousands of years. But the real bombshell came in 2012. A volunteer named Chuck Moreland was excavating a deep unit when he noticed something strange in the sediment, a thin, coffee cream-colored layer threading through the darker soil. He knew immediately what it might be, but he didn't want to get his hopes up. It was tephra, volcanic ash. And when they traced it across the entire excavation, the layer proved to be continuous and unbroken, a pristine timestamp laid down by an enormous eruption of Mount St. Helens more than 15,000 years ago. In geology and archaeology, this is what's called a tephrochronological marker, like a radioactive clock that was set at the moment of the eruption. Anything above that ash is younger than 15,000 years. Anything below it is older. And right there, beneath the ash, Moreland found them. Camel teeth, fragments of enamel from camelops, an extinct species of North American camel that stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder and disappeared from the continent about 11,000 years ago. And alongside those teeth, a perfectly crafted orange agate scraper. I knew what it was, Moreland said later, but I was wondering, is this really what it is? It was. And 3 years later, in 2015, they found a second scraper, buried even deeper in the sediment, below the camel teeth, below the volcanic ash. This one also had residue. When scientists analyzed it, they confirmed the presence of ancient protein from Bison antiquus, a massive extinct relative of the modern buffalo, with horn spans exceeding 6 feet. Someone had used this tool to butcher or process that animal. A human being had sat in this exact spot, in this exact rock shelter, and done what humans do, work with their hands and try to survive. And then the ash fell, and the camel walked past, and the centuries piled up, and eventually we came along with our brushes and our radiocarbon accelerators. When the final dating results came back, confirmed and reconfirmed across multiple independent laboratories, the number was staggering. 18,250 years before present. Plus or minus a margin of error so small it almost doesn't matter. So, what does a date of 18,250 years really mean? Let's put it in context. At that moment in history, the last ice age was at or near its peak. The Laurentide ice sheet, 2 miles thick in places, blanketed all of eastern Canada. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered British Columbia. The two glaciers had merged, effectively sealing off any land route from Alaska into the rest of North America. There was no ice-free corridor. The door was closed. And yet, somehow, humans were in Oregon. This is the puzzle that has sent archaeologists scrambling to rethink everything. If there was no land corridor through the interior at 18,000 years ago, how did people get to Oregon? The answer, increasingly accepted by the scientific community, is that they came by water. They followed the Pacific coastline, hugging the kelp forest ecosystem that stretched from Siberia to South America in a relatively continuous ribbon of marine life. Hunting seals, gathering shellfish, navigating in skin boats from one ice-free cove to the next. This kelp highway hypothesis isn't new. It was proposed decades ago, but for years it lacked the archaeological backbone to stand on. Sites along the ancient coast are notoriously hard to find because sea levels were roughly 300 feet lower during the Ice Age. The coastline those first Americans walked is now underwater. The campsites, the shell middens, the hearths, all drowned. But Rimrock Draw changes the math. If humans were in the deep interior of Oregon 18,000 years ago, they must have arrived on the coast even earlier, perhaps by 20,000 years or more, to allow time for populations to spread inland. Suddenly, the picture of the first Americans transforms from a single migration to a much older, more complex, more oceanic story. And there's another dimension to this discovery that doesn't get nearly enough attention. It's not just about science. It's about memory. David Lewis, an anthropologist at Oregon State University and a descendant of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, points out that the 18,250-year date at Rimrock Draw aligns remarkably well with the oral histories of the tribal nations of the region. Many of these traditions contain stories of the Missoula floods, a series of catastrophic glacial outburst floods that repeatedly reshaped the landscape of the Pacific Northwest between 18,000 and 15,000 years ago. The floods left behind the channeled scablands of Washington, the coulees, the enormous erratic boulders scattered across the hills. Tribes have oral histories of encountering giant animals, monsters on the land, Lewis explained. The megafauna, the mammoths, the camels, the giant ground sloths, those weren't just bones to these people. They were characters in living stories passed down generation after generation for nearly 200 centuries. Think about that. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples in Oregon may contain memories of events that happened 18,000 years ago. The human mind and the human habit of telling stories to our children preserved knowledge across a span of time that makes all of recorded history look like a footnote. At this point, you might be wondering, how confident are scientists in these dates? Couldn't there be contamination? Couldn't the sediments have been disturbed? It's a fair question, and the answer is, the evidence at Rimrock Draw is remarkably robust, precisely because of what nature provided. The key is that volcanic ash layer. The Cédès tephra from Mount St. Helens, identified by its unique mineralogical fingerprint, is not something that can be faked or confused. It was deposited in a single event, across a wide area, and it has been independently dated by multiple methods to approximately 15,600 calibrated years before present. It's a perfect seal. The artifacts below it cannot be younger than that eruption, and the camel enamel dates came not from a single test, but from two separate rounds of radiocarbon dating, first in 2018 and again in 2023, using accelerator mass spectrometry, the most precise dating technology available. Both analyses returned the same result: 18,250 years before present, within a tight margin of error. The stratigraphic layering at the site is also exceptionally clean. The undisturbed sediments show a continuous record from about 7,000 years ago, all the way down to 18,000 years, what O'Grady called magic. Each layer is in perfect order. Nothing has been mixed, nothing has shifted. It is, in archaeological terms, a pristine record. It's not so much that we have such old dates, O'Grady explained, but that we're getting consistent results. For the past 11 years, we're actually seeing something that's preserved through time. The ongoing work at the site is adding even more evidence. Archaeobotanists are studying plant remains from what appear to be ancient cooking fires. Additional teeth from bison and camel are being tested. Each new result is adding another brushstroke to a portrait that is becoming harder and harder to dismiss. Rimrock Draw doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a growing wave of pre-Clovis evidence that is reshaping our entire understanding of human prehistory in the Americas. In New Mexico, fossilized human footprints at White Sands National Park have been dated to an astonishing 23,000 years ago, pushing the timeline back even further, though that dating remains under debate. In Chile, Monteverde has stood for decades as proof that people were in South America well before Clovis. In Mexico, bones from a giant sloth show evidence of human processing dated to around 28,000 years ago. The consensus is shifting. Rapidly. Pre-Clovis is no longer a dirty word, it's the new normal. The question has changed from, did humans arrive before Clovis, to, how much earlier did they arrive, and how did they do it? Some researchers are even suggesting multiple waves of migration, potentially from different source populations. There is genetic evidence suggesting that some ancient South Americans may carry traces of ancestry related to Aboriginal Australians or Melanesians, hinting at a mind-boggling possibility that the peopling of the Americas was not a single clean story, but a complex, multi-chapter saga spanning tens of thousands of years. What Rimrock Draw gives us is a fixed, undeniable point on that timeline, a handhold across 18,000 years of darkness. A small orange stone tool and the blood of an extinct animal that prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that the first Americans were here far earlier and were far more capable than we ever imagined. On a hot summer day in eastern Oregon, a team of archaeologists and volunteers are carefully removing a few more centimeters of desert soil. They are surrounded by an infinity of sagebrush, under a sun that is exactly the same sun that shone on the people who came before them. Somewhere, in the sediment beneath their hands, there may be more scrapers, more teeth, more charcoal from ancient fires. More evidence of lives fully lived in a world that was both utterly alien and fundamentally familiar. Because that's the thing about archaeology at this scale. It doesn't make ancient people feel more distant. It makes them feel closer. Someone made that scraper. Someone held it. Someone used it to feed their family, in a rock shelter in Oregon, while mammoths wandered the plains below, and Mount St. Helens slept quietly in the distance. History didn't start when we decided to write it down. It started the moment someone napped a stone and felt it fit perfectly in their palm. The Rimrock Draw Rockshelter is telling us that story, and we're only just beginning to listen.